Why medieval people rarely washed their wool. When we imagine the Middle Ages, our minds often conjure images of rugged shepherds, bustling marketplaces, and endless fields of sheep grazing beneath gray European skies. Yet, one peculiar detail about medieval life still baffles modern historians. People rarely washed their wool. This wasn't a matter of ignorance or laziness. It was a deliberate choice shaped by economics, technology, and survival. While modern textile industries rely on chemical detergents, industrial scouring, and high heat, medieval communities developed a very different relationship with their fibers. To understand why wool was left unclean, we must step into a world where water was a luxury, cleanliness had moral and religious implications, and every ounce of natural wool was precious. In this video, we'll uncover the surprising reasons behind this practice, from the natural chemistry of lanolin and its protective properties, to the fragile medieval economy that depended on the greasy texture of unwashed wool. What we find is not a tale of filth or neglect, but of practical wisdom deeply rooted in a world without modern industry. The nature of wool, why dirt wasn't the enemy. Wool, unlike cotton or linen, is a living fiber. Each strand is coated with lanolin, a waxy, oily substance secreted by sheep to protect their fleece from rain and cold. In modern terms, lanolin is a natural waterproofing agent, so effective that it's still used in skincare and cosmetics today. In medieval times, however, this oily coating was more than a convenience, it was a survival tool. Medieval people understood, even without scientific terminology, that washing wool thoroughly stripped it of its strength and flexibility. Once the lanolin was gone, the fibers became brittle, harder to spin, and more susceptible to water damage. For a peasant spinning yarn by hand or weaving cloth for winter garments, keeping that natural grease was essential. Additionally, wool that wasn't washed was easier to process with the primitive tools of the period. The natural oils made the fibers slide more smoothly through the fingers during carding and spinning. Artisans working in village workshops or home-based spinning circles often complained that washed wool tangled or broke too easily. So, while to us clean wool might look better, to them it meant more work, less durability, and weaker fabric. Another reason was purely environmental. Medieval Europe did not have easy access to clean, abundant water sources in every region. Even when water was available, heating large quantities of it was a major task. It required firewood, which was often scarce and expensive. Therefore, washing entire fleeces of wool was an unaffordable luxury, especially for peasants who relied on every scrap of material they produced. Beyond practicality, there was also a cultural layer to this choice. In the medieval mindset, cleanliness was not the same as hygiene. Many people associated bathing or excessive washing with vanity or sin, a belief encouraged by certain church doctrines of the time. In this environment, leaving wool as God made it was seen as natural, even virtuous. Thus, the untouched fleece became a quiet symbol of humility and divine order. Finally, it's important to understand that dirty wool didn't stay dirty forever. After spinning, weaving, and dyeing, fabrics went through fulling, a process that involved pounding and washing the cloth to remove grease and impurities. In other words, medieval people weren't wearing filthy clothes. They simply postponed cleaning until the fabric was ready. This method was efficient and sustainable within the constraints of the era. Why medieval people rarely washed their wool. The hidden truth behind hygiene and clothing in the Middle Ages. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often picture peasants trudging through muddy fields in thick woolen garments, knights wrapped in heavy cloaks, and noble ladies draped in layers of fabric. What we rarely stop to consider is how those fabrics were maintained, or more specifically, how seldom they were washed. The idea that medieval people rarely cleaned their wool clothing is not a myth or an exaggeration. It's a fact rooted in practicality, technology, and the very structure of society itself. But the deeper question is this: why didn't they wash it? Was it simple ignorance, lack of access to soap, or something far more complex? The truth is that the reasons were both scientific and social, revealing a world that was far more sophisticated and constrained than modern assumptions often suggest. The material itself, wool as a natural shield. Wool is not like the cotton or polyester fabrics we wear today. It's a living fiber, naturally designed to protect the sheep that produce it. Each wool fiber is coated with a layer of lanolin, a greasy, wax-like substance that repels water and dirt. In medieval times, This property made wool an almost magical fabric. It kept people warm even when damp, resisted stains, and could go weeks, even months, without needing to be washed. The lanolin also provided a mild waterproofing effect, which was invaluable in Europe's cold and often rainy climate. When cloth was produced in the Middle Ages, fullers and weavers intentionally left a portion of this lanolin in the fabric. Washing it thoroughly would remove the protective grease, making garments less durable and less resistant to the elements. For a peasant who might own only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, keeping that lanolin meant survival. The less the wool was washed, the longer it lasted, and the warmer it remained. In other words, washing could literally ruin your only coat. Soap, water, and the cost of cleanliness. Another major factor was the cost and availability of cleaning materials. Soap as we know it today, made with fats and lye, was expensive and not commonly available to the lower classes. Even when it could be obtained, it was often harsh, capable of stripping wool of its essential oils and damaging its texture. Medieval laundry, therefore, was not a matter of tossing clothes into water. It required hours of labor and risked destroying valuable garments in the process. Water, too, was not always pure or accessible. In cities, rivers were polluted by tanners, butchers, and waste from households. Washing clothes in such water didn't necessarily make them cleaner, it could actually make them worse. As a result, people developed other methods to refresh garments, airing them out in the wind, brushing away dirt with stiff tools, and using herbs or smoke to mask odors. It might sound unsanitary by today's standards, but these practices were effective enough for the time and, crucially, they preserved the integrity of the fabric. Cultural and religious attitudes toward washing. Medieval attitudes toward cleanliness were also shaped by religious and philosophical ideas. Cleanliness was associated not only with health but also with morality and spiritual purity. However, physical washing was often considered less important than inner purity. Monks and nuns, for example, might bathe or wash their garments infrequently as a form of humility, believing that the body's discomfort brought them closer to God. Among ordinary people, bathing was seen as a luxury, something to be done occasionally, not routinely. And since clothing was seen as an extension of the body, it followed that garments, too, were not meant to be washed frequently. Interestingly, noble families might have had their garments gently spot cleaned or refitted, but even they didn't wash wool clothing the way we do today. It wasn't until linen undergarments became common that regular washing became part of hygiene culture, because linen, unlike wool, could be easily laundered without losing its quality. The science of smell and survival. It's easy to imagine medieval people surrounded by unpleasant odors, but their sense of smell and their standards were very different from ours. People were used to living close to animals, fires, and other humans. A faint odor of sweat or lanolin wasn't considered offensive. In fact, it was often a sign of hard work and vitality. What mattered more was health and warmth. And wool's natural oils not only provided insulation, they also acted as a barrier against lice and dampness, both of which could be deadly in the wrong conditions. There's also a surprising biological advantage. The lanolin and natural residue in wool created a microenvironment that discouraged bacterial growth. In other words, unwashed wool wasn't as unhygienic as it sounds. Modern tests on ancient fabrics show that wool garments could resist odor and stay relatively clean for long periods, especially in cold climates. The very material that seemed dirty by today's standards was actually self-regulating, a primitive but effective form of antibacterial clothing. From necessity to myth. How we misunderstand the past. Today, when we read about medieval hygiene, it's easy to fall into the trap of superiority, assuming that people in the past were simply ignorant or dirty. But this is a myth born from misunderstanding. The truth is that every decision they made, from how often they washed to how they dressed, was a reflection of their environment, technology, and survival needs. For a 14th century villager, washing wool frequently would have been as absurd as throwing away food. It was wasteful, risky, and unnecessary. Moreover, many modern fabrics require far more maintenance than medieval wool ever did. In some ironic way, our obsession with constant washing has created new problems: polluted water systems, microfiber pollution, and weakened clothing fibers. While the people of the Middle Ages were practicing a kind of accidental sustainability, their clothes lasted longer, were biodegradable, and were cared for in ways that reflected a deep, if unspoken, respect for natural materials. Conclusion: the practical genius of the past, the medieval world was not a dirty, ignorant place. It was a world of adaptation and intelligence. People understood their materials, their limitations, and their climate. They used what they had in the most efficient way possible. Not washing wool wasn't laziness, it was wisdom. So the next time we laugh at medieval hygiene, it's worth remembering. They might have smelled of lanolin and smoke, but their clothes were built to last for years. And perhaps, in their understanding of balance between nature, necessity, and endurance, they were far cleaner in spirit and sustainability than we are today. How medieval people maintained hygiene without modern methods. When we think about hygiene today, we picture hot showers, fragrant soaps, and the crisp feeling of freshly washed clothes. It's difficult to imagine a world where none of those things existed. No plumbing, no antibacterial sprays, no detergents. Yet in the Middle Ages, people still managed to live, work, and even thrive without any of these conveniences. Their understanding of cleanliness was not the same as ours, but it was far from primitive. It was built on observation, adaptation, and a deep connection to the natural world around them. The reality is that medieval hygiene was not about constant washing, it was about maintenance and prevention. People knew that keeping clean wasn't only about soap and water, it was about balance. They worked with what nature gave them, creating an entire system of cleanliness that relied on air, fire, herbs, and discipline. Bathing, a rare but meaningful ritual. Contrary to the myth that people never bathed, bathing was actually an established part of medieval life, just not a daily one. In many European towns, public bathhouses existed where men and women could bathe, socialize, and even receive massages. Water was often heated using wood fires, and people used mixtures of herbs like rosemary, sage, and thyme to perfume the water and protect the skin. However, the frequency of bathing depended on one's social class and geography. Nobles and townsfolk might bathe once or twice a month, while peasants whose lives revolved around physical labor might only bathe a few times a year, often in rivers or wooden tubs. To them, washing the entire body was less important than keeping certain parts clean: hands, face, and feet. Monks and nuns followed strict routines of partial washing, called ablutions, performed before prayers or meals. Cleanliness, in their eyes, was spiritual discipline rather than personal luxury. Even in castles and monasteries, water was a precious resource, carried manually and heated laboriously. Bathing, therefore, was a ceremony of care, not a habit of convenience. Herbal knowledge, nature's pharmacy. Without soap or shampoo as we know them, medieval people turned to the natural world for their cleaning agents. They used lye soap made from ash and animal fat for laundry, and herbal infusions for personal cleansing. Lavender, mint, and sage were particularly valued for their antibacterial and fragrant properties. People would rub herbs directly on their skin or mix them into washing water to reduce odor and repel insects. In the countryside, women passed down recipes for herbal rinses to wash hair and clothes. Vinegar and urine, both containing ammonia, were surprisingly common cleaning tools. Though this sounds unpleasant today, these substances effectively broke down grease and dirt. Wealthy families sometimes imported Castile soap from Spain, made from olive oil, which was gentler and scented. Its rarity made it a symbol of luxury, something reserved for nobles and royalty. Through these practices, medieval society built a kind of natural chemistry, long before the rise of modern science. People knew what worked, even if they couldn't explain why. It was experience, not textbooks, that shaped their hygiene. Air and fire, the invisible cleansers. For medieval people, fresh air and fire were cleansing forces. They believed that foul smells carried disease, a concept known as miasma theory. To combat this, they burned incense, herbs, and wood indoors to purify the air. These scents didn't just mask odors, the smoke actually helped deter insects and bacteria. Clothing was often hung over smoke or near fires to remove dampness and kill lice. Wealthier homes had large fireplaces where garments were aired after use, especially during winter. In villages, people used the open wind, leaving bedding and cloaks outside for hours to refresh them. The logic was simple: wind and fire could chase away what water could not. This combination of air, warmth, and smoke created an early, low-tech hygiene system, one that, ironically, modern science now validates. Smoke truly does have antibacterial properties, and sunlight kills pathogens. In their own intuitive way, medieval people understood environmental hygiene long before the germ theory of disease was ever conceived. The story of medieval hygiene isn't one of filth, it's one of adaptation, survival, and intelligence. They built systems that worked without electricity, plumbing, or modern chemistry, and they did so for centuries. If you enjoyed discovering how people of the past kept themselves and their world clean, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into ancient technology, forgotten traditions, and the hidden science behind history's most fascinating eras.